Bonjour tout le monde. Today we're going to be talking about le passé composé. So we'll jump into it right away because you're probably, what is le passé composé? We'll talk about that in our lesson, bien sûr. You'll see it sometimes abbreviated as PC. So in the context of French grammar, if you see that, we're referring to passé composé. How do you conjugate verbs for the passé composé in French? And what are some exceptions? So we'll start with what is le passé composé. This is one of our ways that we talk about things in the past in French. Unlike in English, there are multiple ways to talk about things in the past. So le passé composé is specifically for things that happen in the past once or at a specific time. For example, I ate cereal for breakfast this morning. That would be le passé composé. After high school, I went to UCLA, right? I could tell you the day that I started. Even if I don't have it memorized, I could, in theory, pinpoint that date. It will be a lot easier to know when to use le passé composé after we talk about l'imparfait, which is our other past tense. So for now, don't sweat too much about when to use each one. Let's talk more about how to write it. So how do I conjugate verbs for le passé composé in French? We've got a couple of steps. Step one is to conjugate your helping verb, usually avoir, sometimes être. We'll talk about when is être for who you're talking about. Step two is to change the end of the verb you need in the past tense or to use the irregular form. We'll talk about the endings for regular verbs in the past tense as well as some of the common irregular ones. And then we put the two together. It's really important that in le passé composé you always have a two-word answer for your past verb. Let me show you some examples of what I'm talking about. But first, we'll do a reminder of avoir. So when I say that you need to conjugate it for who you're talking about, as a reminder, this is what that would look like. So if you're saying, I have done something in the past, it's going to start with j'ai. If you're talking about somebody, you're talking to somebody and you're saying, oh, you have eaten cereal or something like that, it's going to be tu as or vous avez. For he, they, or she have, il, elle, elle a. Nous avons or on a for we have, and il, elle ont for they have. And then for our verb endings, again, as a reminder, we have er verbs, ir verbs, re verbs. So if we have an er verb, like aimer or danser, something that ends with er, to make it ready for the past tense, we drop the er and we replace it with I, accent grave, I, accent aigu, going up from left to right. For ir verbs, we drop the ir at the end and we replace it with the letter I. And for re verbs like répondre or vendre, we drop the re and we replace it with you. So aimer sounds the same but looks different, aimer. Danser, danser. Agir becomes agi. Choisir becomes choisi. Répondre, répondu. Vendre, vendu. Let's take a look at some examples because seeing it put together I think is what is the most helpful but also the most challenging step. So say we wanted to say we danced and we want to do it in passé composé, past tense. We're going to first conjugate our helping verb for who we're talking about. Let's use nous as an example here. So we'll say nous avons. We start with avoir and we make it into our form for nous. Then we change the end of the verb we need in the past tense. In that case, that is to dance, which is danser. So we're going to cross off the er and replace it with an I accent aigu. Now we put them together. Nous avons dansé. We need both of these words next to each other to make it mean we danced. It's very easy for people to forget the avons and to tell me nous danser. You really need both for it to be correct here. And then as a reminder for the negative, the ne and pas go around just the first verb. So to say we didn't dance, nous n'avons pas dansé. Let's take a look at another example together. How about for she talked? First, we'll conjugate our helping verb for who we're talking about. Elle a. Then we'll change the end of the verb for to talk, which is parler. Same thing, we'll drop the er, replace it with an I accent aigu. And then we put the two together. Elle a parlé. Ça c'est comme on dit she talked. And then to make it negative, it'd be elle n'a pas parler. Again, we see the ne and pas just around this first verb. Let's look at one that's not an ER verb. Same steps for I responded. We'll start with our helping verb, avoir, conjugated for I, or in French, je. So we have j'ai. We change the ending of the verb we need. So répondre ends with re, which means we're going to cross that out and change it to a u. And then we put the two together. J'ai répondu. Ou au négatif, je n'ai pas répondu. Let's take a look at maybe for an IR verb. Same steps. For you chose, we have two options for you. It could be tu or vous. So let's take a look at how both would look. We'll have tu as or vous avez. We'll change the end of the verb we need in the past tense. So choisir, we drop the IR, replace it with an I. And this is going to look the same no matter who we're talking about, right? So we have tu as choisi or vous avez choisi. This first part, the helping verb, the avoir conjugation, is the only part that changes based on who we're talking about. No matter who we're talking about, me, you, us, we, they, she, choisi is always going to be the second word, and it's always going to look the same. We need the negative. It could be tu n'as pas choisi or vous n'avez pas choisi. And like all things with French, let's talk about some exceptions because you know that there are some. There are some verbs that have just an irregular form in the past. So when we talk about past participle, we're talking about the part where you're taking the verb, dropping the ending, and usually replacing it with an E, accent aigu, an I, or a U. There are some that don't follow that pattern. There are many more than I have up here on the slide. These are just the most common ones that come up. But in general, if you feel like you've followed the rules for how to make a verb in its past participle and it looks very strange, chances are that's because it's irregular. So let's start with avoir, which is to have. The past participle for that is going to be eu. So to say I had would be j'ai eu. Faire, which is to do or to make. The past participle is fait. So j'ai fait, ça veut dire I did. Next we have dire, ça veut dire to say. Dit, D-I-T. Right? Again, you'll notice if we were following the rules, we would drop the R-E and replace it with a U, and we'd have D-I-U. You can probably tell something is a little bit off with that, so that's a good reminder. It is irregular. We would say dit, j'ai dit, I said. Mettre is to put. So we have mis, par exemple, j'ai mis is I put. Écrire, to write. Écrit, j'ai écrit, ça veut dire I wrote. Voir, to see, would be vu. J'ai vu, I saw. And it's not just the past participles that can be irregular. There are some times where we are going to use être as our helping verb instead of avoir as our helping verb. So the way we practiced just now in all the other examples, conjugating avoir for who we're talking about, there are times where we will do that with être instead. There's a whole list of them, but an easy way to remember is that they are verbs that have to do with coming and going. That could be either literally, like arriver, aller, retourner, or figuratively, like naître, to be born, mourir, to die. Quick refresher for être, that'd be je suis, tu es or vous êtes, il, elle est, nous sommes ou on est, il, elles sont. Okay. The steps are the same, just looks different with what your helping verb is. So we conjugate our helping verb. For she went, we know that is a verb that talks about coming or going somewhere. So our helping verb is going to be être. So we'll start with elle est instead of elle a. Change the ending. To go is aller. Cross that out, replace it with an e accent aigu. And then we put the two together. Elle est, aller. You will notice though, I added an extra e at the end. When you have être as your helping verb, this past participle needs to agree in gender and number. So because I'm talking about somebody female, I add another e at the end here. And then if we need it negative, that would be elle n'est pas allée. So another example, they were born. We conjugate our verb, so we have ils sont as our helping verb because being born has to do with arriving at the planet, so to speak. So it falls into our category of verbs that have to do with coming and going. Then we change the end of the verb. This one's irregular, so I'm just going to give it to you. Instead of naître, we just say né. Then we put the two together. Ils sont nés. But remember, we need this to agree in terms of gender and number. So because we're talking about they, we add an S at the end to make it plural. The negative would be ils ne sont pas nés. Et ça, c'est tout. We'll practice a lot together for passé composé. So go ahead and just jot down anything you are missing so we can practice together.